In Season 3, Episode 13 of Star Trek The Next Generation, Deja Q, the Enterprise is trying to help some aliens with their moon, which has entered a decaying orbit for unknown reasons and is about to obliterate one of their continents. This isn't a review, so I will refrain from commenting on the plot too much. I'm mainly concerned with whether they got the science right. And if you want to tell me that all this science mambo-jumbo is a secondary concern at best, since its only purpose is to lend stakes to the A-plot, and therefore the question of its accuracy matters very little to the value of the episode as a work of fiction, I'd say I agree. Somehow all my 5-minute videos turn out to be 20 minutes long. I don't know how this is happening.
The satellite's trajectory is continuing to deteriorate, Captain. This orbit will put it within 500 kilometers of the planet's surface.
On Earth, this would put it at the bottom of the exosphere. For reference, the ISS orbits at around 410 kilometers. This isn't Earth, and a small moon would experience a lot more drag than a space station, so this is reasonable. From information given later in the episode, we can estimate that Brielle 4's mass is between 6 and 8 times that of the Earth. And the moon in its usual orbit goes around the planet every 12 hours 26 minutes. It must be terribly inconvenient for werewolves to have a full moon twice a day.
Mr. LaForge, is there any way that the Enterprise could coax that satellite back where it belongs?
We'd need to apply a delta V of about 4 kilometers per second. Even with warp power to the tractor beam, it would mean exceeding the recommended impulse engine output by at least 47%. It would be like an ant pushing a tricycle. Slim chance at best.
Not only is delta V a real physics term, it's used correctly and with the right unit. Their moon's normal orbital velocity is about 7 kilometers per second, so this also broadly checks out. It might seem a little weird that Geordi is talking about required engine power when delta V is the change in velocity, which could be achieved with less thrust over a longer period of time, but this is addressed later.
We need more time or power, and we're short on both.
The difficulty of returning the moon to its original orbit is communicated here, but there's no discussion about how likely it is for this plan to make the situation better at all, or at least stop it from getting worse. If the Enterprise could reliably delay the impact by at least one orbit on every attempt, that would give Starfleet time to bring in more equipment or find a better solution. This doesn't come up because even as they improve their approach, the interference from A-plot shenanigans keeps getting worse, so they never buy themselves more than one orbit's worth of time, and the ticking clock element of the plot is preserved. Speaking of shenanigans, naked John Delancey flashes the bridge. It turns out that Picard's least favorite trickster god, Q, was exiled by his fellows for generally being a nuisance. He requests sanctuary on the Enterprise, as it later turns out to escape the wrath of alien civilizations with grudges against him.
You have a dangerous man out there with a huge arse.
The teaser is a quite competently written exposition scene. All too often, sci-fi TV shows just give up in the face of having to relay a large amount of world building to the audience and resort to having the main cast sit down in a circle, explaining things they all already know to each other.
Macri fever has a 95% mortality rate, which translates into 31 million dead on Rogena.
Yeah, that qualifies.
And all we have to do to stop it is escort an unarmed convoy of Weiss relief ships through Acheron.
Well, you know what an expressway that place is. We go there, we cut our transit time in half. Like it or not, passing through Acheron is our only chance of getting to Rogena before that epidemic runs its course.
What's the delay? It's not like Acheron is chock full of old High Guard missile batteries operated by psychopathic Drago-Katzoff-Nietzscheans. Oh wait, it is! Going through Acheron.
In this case, people in charge of knowing things are relaying information and proposing solutions to the person in charge of being in charge, as you would expect to happen in this situation.
We can't change the gravitational constant of the universe, but if we wrap a low-level warp field around that moon, we could reduce its gravitational constant. Make it lighter so we can push it.
This logic seems off. Would locally altering the value of the gravitational constant, whatever that's supposed to mean exactly, also affect the inertial mass? Since the tractor beam is also vaguely described as manipulating gravity in some way, wouldn't reducing the gravitational constant make it less effective, cancelling out the improvement? And if you can alter how much the moon is affected by gravity, do you still need to push it? Can't you just let it go for a while? I have to let this one slide, but I'm guessing it would sound silly to a real physicist.
Moon will hit its perigee in 10 hours. Now,
The periapsis is the lowest point in a body's orbit. Technically, perigee refers to the periapsis of a satellite orbiting Earth, but whatever.
Good Lord, what is happening in there? Aurora Borealis?
There is an issue with trying to circularize the orbit by applying thrust at the periapsis, whatever you want to call it.
Ah, number one. Look at this.
To explain, I'll have to start up my totally accurate orbital mechanics simulator of choice, Kerbal Space Program. Here we have a small, self-propelled satellite on an eccentric orbit around the planet, currently approaching periapsis. We point it in the prograde direction, that is, along its trajectory, and fire the engine. Unfortunately, this makes the apoapsis rise, while the periapsis stays the same, more or less.
Too bad.
The key insight here, I think, is that orbits are periodic, they repeat. If at the end of a maneuver the orbiting object has a specific position and velocity, then as long as no external force is applied in the meantime, after one orbital period it will have the same position and velocity again.
Like clockwork.
And if the maneuver takes a relatively short time, the position of the object at the end of it will be close to the position at the start. So applying thrust here affects the orbit over there and vice versa. Trying to pull the moon up won't work either for the same reason. We can think of the periapsis as the point in the orbit where the satellite ends its descent and starts ascending. If we impart some upward velocity to it now, the lowest point of the orbit must move back, and it has to be even lower than the current one. If we impart so much velocity that the object is now going straight up, then it's going to either escape into space or it will eventually come back straight down. Of course, once it reaches a high enough altitude, we could use a second burn to set it on a circular orbit again, but this whole process would require a substantial amount of delta V, much more than simply applying thrust at the apoapsis, which is the correct way to do this. Applying thrust over there affects the orbit down here, and you also don't have to get dangerously close to the atmosphere this way. I think it's worth noting that the Enterprise is putting itself in unnecessary danger because they're doing it wrong. Unfortunately, this means the script fundamentally depends on a misunderstanding of physics.
The Enterprise will be dangerously close to the atmosphere.
That's the problem.
To fix it, it's not sufficient to find and replace perigee with apogee. The writer would have to come up with an alternate excuse as to why the Northern Lights can't be repelled by the shields this time.
I could have been killed. If it hadn't been for Data, no more me. And no one would have missed me, would they? When I ask myself if I would have done the same for him, and I'm forced to answer no, I feel ashamed. I don't have what it takes. Without my powers, I'm frightened of everything. I'm a coward. And I'm miserable. And I can't go on this way.
At this point, the A-plot and the B-plot come together in an impasse, and the crisis is resolved by divine intervention. Because it's not really about exploring the limits of technology or speculating on scientific hypotheticals. It's about a supernatural entity learning the true meaning of compassion and sacrifice.
Nothing is impossible, not if you can imagine it. That's what being a scientist is all about.
No, that's what being a magical elf is all about.
It has been suggested that this episode could have been improved by making it a test for humanity arranged by Q, but one might as well say this episode would be improved by rewriting it from scratch, which is always potentially the case.
Think, Picard, think.
As presented, the moral dilemma lacks any teeth. In this trolley problem, to one track we have tied a supernatural tyrant indirectly responsible for the deaths of at least 18 Enterprise crew members, and on the other track, millions of innocent civilians.
He's not worth it.
This is a choice that's perhaps difficult to follow through on, but not one difficult to make. As a starship captain, Picard has traded the lives of better men for less. Of course, there is something to be said about giving up someone who is technically a civilian who's requested asylum to be subjected to mob justice. I'm sure Picard would turn this into a measure of IQ if he had the power to do so, which is presumably why the writers made it so he doesn't. This isn't constructed as a challenge for Picard, Riker, or the Federation principles.
Have we become so fearful? Have we become so cowardly?
It can only be a personal challenge to Q's selfishness.
These aren't my colors!
Indeed, Q decides to put the needs of the many above the needs of the one. His suicide by steamed ham is facilitated by an unusual amount of contrived negligence.
Oh, really? I'm sorry, but this is nonsense.
This crewman is explicitly ordered to stay with Q, but immediately evaporates. As Q confesses how he's feeling amounts of anxiety, pain and shame he has never experienced before, namely any, and all but declares outright he's going to throw himself at the mercy of Aurora Borealis, Picard proceeds to do nothing in particular about it. I don't expect an emotional reaction, but a security detail would be nice.
I suggest you change your attitude. Petulance does not become you.
Q then enters the main hangar bay and somehow steals a shuttle without anyone stopping him along the way.
How could he get to the shuttle bay and leave the Enterprise without us knowing? That's not possible.
Take it easy, West.
Starfleet's security is well established to be kind of shit, but this is a bit much.
Yes, I suppose you're right. Death of a coward, then, so be it. But as a human, I would have died of boredom.
Aside from a few bits of lazy writing and 7 out of 10 IGN science, this is a good episode. Within the self-imposed remit of this channel, just the fact that one can point at elements of the plot and say, oh, this is wrong, is worth partial points. On my provisional scale of sci-fi viscosity that I made up just now, the Falling Moon is a Class 1 phenomenon. You could show just this episode to a scientist who's never watched Star Trek and get a professional opinion on how much sense it makes.
When it comes to Star Trek, I hold these things. The Star Trek needs to get science more right than Star Wars does.
For contrast, an example of a Class 2 phenomenon would be the tractor beam. In this episode, it's used to push a large rock. If you ask, can a tractor beam actually do this? The only people who can give you a meaningful answer are ones who have seen other episodes of TNG. Lastly, when the steamed hams first show up, they scan the ship with barefold rays and attack Q with tachyons. This tells us nothing. It wouldn't make any more or less sense if they used tachyons for scanning and barefold rays to attack. These are Class 3 details, which is to say, plain old lazy writing. The writer needs an excuse for why something is happening, so he takes a card out of the random sci-fi buzzword deck. It should not come as a surprise that putting work into the logical consistency of the world building pays dividends in verisimilitude. So being made mostly out of Class 1 and preferably a small number of Class 2 mechanics is a property of good science fiction, though neither a necessary nor sufficient one. But I guess that's a topic for another time.